Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today, putting the garden to bed, so to speak, or I mean, that's at least how I say it. That is the topic of the day, and you know I am not doing this by myself. I am joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. It's looking like the weather may finally start cooperating with putting the garden to bed. Maybe.
Maybe. So we spoke it into being, or maybe we like reverse spoke it into being, because last week we said it wasn't going to rain, and then with a predicted chance of like 18%, it rained here in Macomb. And everyone was like shocked, surprised, celebrating, and then it cooled off a little bit. But I saw 80 degrees this Saturday. Beautiful fair weather. I'm sure you're looking ahead because you might be going to that Illinois football game, right?
We're going to a soccer tournament, so.
Oh, darn it.
Yeah.
Next time then.
Next time. Michigan game.
Oh yeah. That'll be fun. So
yeah, we got rain down here. We even got a little hail in Jacksonville. Or south of us.
Congratulations.
Got quite a bit. So
yeah. Stuff falling from the sky. It was really exciting. Haven't seen that for a couple months.
Everybody's welcome.
Yes. Yep. Yep. So because we said it wasn't going to rain, it rained. I also wound up watering my lawn, which I don't normally do, but I bought some really nice turf seed, which I think we talked about last week. And, but also I just wanted to get some moisture in the ground, because our shrubs, our trees, everything just started dropping leaves. No fall color, just leaves started falling. And they're like crispy, so they're dried out, they're desiccated. So really even our woody plants, our big shade trees, everything was feeling that drought. Could probably use a little bit more rain, but you know what? Well, I'm happy with what we got.
Take what you can get.
That's exactly right. Yes. So, well, Ken, last week we talked about some of those common fall tasks that we can be doing. But one of those sort of big ones is as I call it, putting the garden to bed. Do you call it anything different? That's what I say. I put the garden to bed.
Yeah, garden to bed, garden cleanup, something along those lines. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so that's what we're going to discuss today. And we're going to try to differentiate between our vegetable gardens and our landscape beds. So I guess starting off though, why would we do this? What's the point of cleaning up our garden and landscape beds this time of year? Why do you do it, Ken?
Because society dictates we do.
Yes, society demands a manicured yard.
So I guess like you mentioned, separate vegetables and landscape beds and stuff. So I mean, for me, vegetables, there's that pest, disease, and insect management is the main thing that I'm doing that for. And then if I want to plant stuff early in the spring, it's cleaned up. I don't have to do that. I can just go out and plant with minimal cleanup. I'm not having to pull everything out before I can plant. Ornamental beds, in my opinion, you don't really need to do a whole lot, but that's going to depend on the individual, how clean you want that to be. But in my view, an ornamental is not as important.
Right. Yeah. I'm kind of in that same boat, where I let the ornamental things sort of stay. I like seeing the seed heads in the winter. Some of those plants will flower until we get our first really hard frost. So I just let them go. Then I forget about them. It gets cold and I hide in the indoors for the winter time. And then I forget about what happened until I come back out next spring, like a bear. So, well, let's start with our vegetable beds. You talked about disease problems and disease control. So what is the purpose of that? Because doesn't the cold just kill everything? Why would we even care if a sick plant stays in the garden over winter? I mean, it's dead, the disease is gone, right? That's how it works.
Yeah, so a lot of the diseases, we think about tomatoes, for example. A lot of people grow tomatoes. A lot of those foliar diseases like the septoria leaf spot, um, some of the blights and stuff. Those pathogens will actually overwinter on plant material. So if you leave that plant material in your landscape, in your garden, and you've had those diseases, you've got all of that inoculum, that fungus and stuff surviving on that plant material. And if you leave it there, it's going to be there come spring. You're going to be a lot more likely to have that because you haven't removed it. So many of the diseases that we have issues with in our gardens will overwinter on that plant material. Same thing with insects. Sometimes those insects will overwinter on there. Things like squash bugs will overwinter in debris. So cleaning up the debris, getting out those overwintering areas for insects. Um, the plant materials that those diseases are surviving on, we can remove that, reduce that inoculum, reduce the chances of having those diseases present. They're still probably going to be there, but there's not going to be as much there to potentially infect your plants that following year.
And someone had asked me this question. It was a phone call that I had gotten, and they said, "Well, my peppers had what they thought was bacterial blight. There was no lab test really confirm this, so I don't know if that's what it actually was. And they also didn't send me any photographs. So, I said there's a lot of things that can look like bacterial blight. There's a lot of diseases out. There's also a lot of environmental things that can also happen to our plants that can mimic the signs of a disease. But I said, let's assume that you have bacterial blight. And they said, well, what can I spray now? Now being the first week of October. I said, well, really, I don't think I'd invest much money in spraying your peppers for bacterial blight. Usually, the thing we recommend, whether it's in the end of the season, the middle, or the beginning, if you have a infected plant with that, you pull it out. You remove it, you, as we say, rogue it out, and you get rid of that. You take it off site so that inoculum is not there for next year. This next question, though, was because I had said, well, this disease can also persist in the soil, not for very long. I think it can persist. I read up to about 2 years. Has to have certain debris and things like that. There's these other factors that allow it to persist, but it can be in your soil. And he said, well, what can I spray my soil with? So that is that's a it's a pretty simple question. There's nothing you can really spray your soil with to rid it of bacterial blight. But there is the other side of the coin where like commercial growers, farmers, ornamental plant producers will actually not spray their soil to sterilize it, but they'll pasteurize it. A lot of times they'll use steam treatments. Um, if you could use fumigants, but you would need a serious pesticide license for that because fumigants are very toxic. You really need to know what you're doing in that regard. I don't know if Illinois Department of Ag gives out as many fumigation licenses these days anymore. Anyway, um, so there are things that can be done, but for most backyard gardeners, you're not going to invest thousands of dollars in a steam pasteurization machine. Um, but I've seen it done. It is pretty cool the way they do that. Um, but I would say, yeah, we can't really spray our soil to get rid of these organisms. Um, One, if you would do something like that, it would more sterilize your soil. That's what people would do with like 20 mule team borax when they're trying to fight creeping Charlie. That mixture actually sterilizes the soil, which makes it inhospitable to anything, even your plants that you want to grow. So that's why we don't recommend using 20 mule team borax on stuff. So uh, essentially saying, long way about, I told them to do crop rotation. So every about 3 year crop rotation for that would work.
Yeah, that and when you're pulling the plants, you're trying to get as much of that root system out as you can is going to be important to you. So if there are any pathogens that can survive on those roots, you get those out. And the other thing was a methyl bromide was the
Hmm.
kind of the fumigant of choice, and that's no longer
Yep.
available. And you would still have to have a an applicator's license in order
Hmm.
to get that or buy that. So
That methyl bromide, that was the one when I was in ag school. That was the one where um, the stories of that particular chemical are pretty gruesome. That it's very dangerous. Lots of mistakes have happened in the past with that one. That's why we don't really use that anymore. Grain fumigation, I don't know if that's really much of a thing, but that's a different world than I operate in.
I don't operate there either. So
Yeah, so couldn't tell you. I'm sure someone will say, "Oh yeah, we do it all the time for this or that." Like, well, I don't know. Horticulture, not so often.
Yeah. So we've talked kind of like vegetable gardens, but even if you've got like fruit trees, cleaning those up. So if you've got apples, for example, you've got some of those fruit rots and things like that on there.
Hmm.
Those apples drop to the ground, even if you have insects in there. Don't just leave the apples because again, that fungus and stuff is living in and on the apples. Those mummies and stuff, they're hanging in the trees. You want to remove all of that stuff, get that out of your landscape, so you don't have that inoculum that's going to be spreading. The following year, same thing with the leaves. Clean those up, um, bag them, shred them, get them out of there. So again, you don't have that inoculum to reinfect your plants
Hmm.
the following year. So, vegetable garden, fruit plants, try to get as much of that cleaned up as you can. Try to lessen some potential problems you're going to have that following year.
And you did hear Ken right, folks. He did say mummies, fruit mummies. So mummified fruit. Uh, that is where the fruit essentially has become infected that year, and but it stays attached to that tree with the expectation that when that fungus, ooh, so I like that one, fungus comes out of dormancy next year, reawakens and reinfects the developing fruit or leaves of that tree. So mummified fruit, you heard it correctly, fruit mummies.
And if you've only got a couple of trees, it won't take long to clean all that up. Commercial level, they've got acres and acres of plants. They're cleaning all that stuff up. So,
Well, we talk about diseases, but the other reason that we would want to clean up our vegetable garden is because maybe we want to add something to the soil. Maybe we need to adjust something, whether that's adding something like a compost, manures. If we have done a soil test and we see maybe our pH is a little bit off, we wanted to add some type of either a lime or a sulfur to adjust that pH. And when you have a bed free of the vegetable debris, that makes that process much easier to do. So that's another reason why we would want to have a cleaner bed. In addition to that, insect and disease control is also if you want to add anything to it, just as easier that way.
man, with that, the pH adjustment of soil falls a good time because that can take some time for that to actually work for those
Hmm.
that breakdown and that chemical process that's taking place. That can take several months to happen. So doing that in the fall gives you some time for that adjustment to start that those levels, pH levels raising or lowering it, whatever you're doing, gives that some time to actually happen before you're starting to plant again.
That's right. And most of the time when I'm recommending people to adjust their vegetable garden pH is because that for years they have added wood ash to their vegetable garden, which is alkaline. Just this summer, I think I saw a soil test. The pH was something in the upper eighths. Um, so that's very alkaline. That's not very common in Illinois, at least. Um, and so that would be a time where you want to acidify your soil because our most of our vegetable plants like a slightly acidic soil. So we would bring it down with a little bit of sulfur. But as Ken said, these things take time to adjust themselves. Just as it took them years to bump up their pH with wood ash, it will take you years to kind of readjust that soil back down to a more proper pH level for most vegetable plants.
Another thing you could amend with, and may or may not be a good idea, if you're putting manures down, if those are not composted, you have to have, was it 120, 90 days?
120 days.
120 days between putting that down before you can harvest stuff that's going to be in contact with that. So, if you are going to be using manures and if you're using manure, that hasn't been broken down at all. So you're introducing probably weed seeds and stuff like that. So, do
Mhm.
that with some caution and know what you're getting yourself into if you're doing this. But doing that in the fall, if you are going to do it, will give you that time for that to, so you have that interval that you need to reduce any chances of diseases that are going to affect humans coming into contact with the stuff you're harvesting.
Yeah. And allow that product to break down so that it doesn't tie up a terrible amount of nitrogen the next year. Yeah, if you're using manures, almost always our recommendation is incorporate that in the fall, and so then it's ready next spring.
Don't use dog and cat, regardless.
Yeah, do not, no meat eaters, please. That includes us humans.
I would say
Uh,
manures are probably a little, that's like next level
mhm.
gardening. If you haven't done a whole lot of gardening, I wouldn't jump into the manure
Yeah.
um, amendments
Yeah.
quite yet.
I feel like it is something that we always talk about. Like we always throw manures in there because, well, frankly, a lot of people used to also have livestock in some way or form. And so that was always like an amendment for the garden. But most people aren't farmers. Most people don't have livestock anymore. So I think manure, that when we talk about that as amendment, it's kind of a holdover from the past. Um, but even those who do raise livestock, they are looking for places to offload some of their manures. Um, but I'm in the same camp as Ken, where I'm like, yeah, use them with caution. We have weed seeds. There are certain herbicides that can carry through even the digestion process of that animal. Um, so just be cautious with them. Kind of know your source if you are going to use manure, and you're going to get weed seeds. That is pretty much a guarantee.
You've been warned.
Yep. Well, we've talked about gardens, but what about our landscape beds? You've heard both Ken and I say, well, we don't really do much about our landscape beds in the fall. Um, but let's start with our lawns. How about that? Because that is something where I do pay a little bit more attention to in the fall. Um, and it is their recommendation that often comes at the beginning and the end of the mowing season, and that is, do we cut our lawns shorter for the final mowing of the year? And I often recommend it depends on the cut height that you normally have. If you're mowing your lawn at a height of like 4 or 5 inches, then it might be recommended to bump that down a little bit to 3 or 2 inches. And that's only because that when you get taller grass like that, especially with snow cover or some of the debris that can fall on lawns over the winter, you can get something like snow mold. Um, so the shorter lawn, it doesn't really mat on top of itself that much. Um, but I often just say, when in doubt, just leave your mowing height wherever it is. If you've never had issues with snow mold in your lawn, you probably don't need to worry much about it until you see it. And then you can worry about it. But yeah, I don't adjust my mowing height any lower or taller or anything any time of the year. So it stays at 3.5 inches is what my cut height is. And I don't deviate.
Yeah, ours is whatever the highest setting is on the lawnmower.
Mm.
I've never measured, but it's as high as it will go on the mower. So
Yep. Mhm. And we just stick with that. So I guess, and then the thing that I pay a lot of attention to is leaves. So there is definitely a movement of folks saying leave the leaves be. One of my favorite things that I've read recently on social media is something along the lines of, the leaves that fall to the ground are not going to break into your house and drink all your wine. They're just going to sit on the ground and decompose. It's something like that. Um, yeah, that's true. That's very true. Um, but I do not want the leaves to suffocate and smother my turf grass. So I do I do mow them, I shred them, and I either filter those shredded leaves back to the lawn to add organic matter back to the soil, or I will take those leaves to some of my other landscape beds and I will use those as mulch elsewhere. But I do get them off the lawn. And I know they're also, you're probably screaming at me. People are saying, well, who cares about your lawn? Just kill it. And I'm like, well, yeah, I do kill a lot of lawn every year. More and more of my lawn gets killed. But those then get put in as pollinator gardens, shrub beds, landscape beds, trees, other things. So I still have to have a lawn. And so, and if I smother my lawn, well, then I have to spend more money and resources, energy on rebuilding that lawn every single year. So I'm going to take care of my lawn properly, and I'm going to also make sure that I have space for insects and all those other things to overwinter. So yes, I do shred leaves. I also rake other leaves into landscape beds. I use other leaves as mulch. And there's places where I will leave the leaves be. So we can have our cake and eat it too.
I do something similar. So for our yard, I usually rake or blow the leaves into a pile kind of in the corner. That's just where we put them. Um, because so we've got a couple walnut trees that are in the neighbor's yard that overhang ours. So those leaves break down pretty quick. They're not much of a concern, but we do have a couple maple trees that if we don't do something, that will smother the grass. So we get that cleaned up, and then everybody around me rakes their leaves and bags them. So we drive around the neighborhood, take everybody's bags, shred them because they're going to the I think Jacksonville burns them, or I don't know what they do with them. Um, those are going to be disposed of anyway, so I shred those and use those as mulch and store them in bags so I can use them in the spring. So use some in the fall, save it for the spring, and then that's my mulch for majority of our landscape beds now. We use shredded leaves.
And a lot of those overwintering insects, they can bed down in those shredded leaves. A lot of birds and things will also forage in those shredded leaves. And so, um, yeah, we do hear you if you're telling us that leaves protect insects. We get it. Um, but I also want to encourage folks that, you know, utilize those leaves. Yeah, I hope Jacksonville doesn't burn their leaves because, boy, that's awful, especially if you have asthma or something. But yeah, use those leaves. They're packed full of energy. Use them somehow.
So yeah, for our landscape beds, if there's leaves falling in there, I just leave them.
Mhm.
Becomes a bit of a nightmare in the spring when I go to clean it out because sometimes we have 6 to 8 inches of matted down leaves in some spots, and that
Yeah.
takes a lot of work to get cleaned up. But
Mhm.
yep, just just leave it be.
I think our idea for future episode is going to be soft landings under trees. That's where we can get more into the leaves, leave the leaves thing, have plants under your trees, more about those insects. So we should talk about soft landings one of these days. So we'll put a little pin
Put
in
it
that one.
put it on the list.
Yes, it's on the list. Well, Ken, we got some rain. I felt the need to water my trees, so I did, and then it rained. So, but what about watering some of our woody plants? Is that something that we would also need to do in order to put the landscape to bed?
Yeah, I'd say especially a year like this where it's been dry, a lot of the states in drought or close to it, providing that water, that inch or two of water a week. I think we talked about last week too, especially for like those or needled evergreens or evergreen
Mhm.
plants because they're going to be transpiring throughout the year. It's going to reduce some, but they're still using water. Even our woody plants, our deciduous plants, they're still going to need water throughout this throughout the winter. They'll be taking up water until the ground freezes and stuff. So making sure there's adequate water supply there, so we don't have damage to those plants because they're going into the winter in drought-like situations. Just and
Mhm.
they'll make them hardier, better able to survive winter conditions, especially if we get a really cold, polar vortex stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, something where they cannot access any of that water in the soil at all, then they will at least be off on a better foot, root, whatever you want to call it, for when that hard winter weather does come into play. I mean, I hope it does. It'd be nice to have a good winter. I know we're probably in the minority for the most part of wanting that, but that's why we
Well,
grow our beards.
yes, and then and soils that have more moisture in them can retain more heat, so they don't get near. It's not like they're going to get super cold, but they'll retain more of that heat. If it's really dry, that cold can penetrate
Mhm.
deeper into that soil too. Especially if you think about like potted plants. If you've got pots you're leaving out and you've got perennials in there, um, ideally you're putting perennials in there that can handle a zone or two colder than we're at. But if those are dry, that coldness can get in there a lot easier. That moisture will retain some heat as
Yeah.
well.
And even as water freezes, it releases heat. That's why orchards will sprinkle. Well, they'll do an overhead sprinkler on their trees if there's a frost coming. They'll water their tree canopies because as that water freezes, it releases heat, and then it gives it just
Just
barely
enough.
enough, just enough. keep that blossom from being killed. Well, Ken, as we said, we don't do much cleanup in the landscape. I guess there might be a few things where I say, well, I know this particular plant spreads pretty prolifically by seed, so I might deadhead it. I might take the seed head off of it, just because I don't want to be pulling up its babies all over the place. Very often, I'm lucky enough that I have this, but I'll take those seed heads and I'll put them in kind of an out of the way area where it's okay if they seed sprout. Um, not everybody has that. So I guess, sometimes I will take my Joe Pye weed and I'll take some of the seed heads off of there. I do have my zigzag goldenrod, that I also will deadhead because that really likes to spread as well. So there's a few that I will clean up, but for the most part, I don't touch much for the fall. And you wrote like two very good articles about this, about how we can clean up our landscapes, but also with the insects in mind that can use some of these hollow stems and things for overwintering habitat. So maybe, I guess, expound on this, share your knowledge of these articles.
Yeah. So you work with that, like the deadheading and stuff. So yeah, this weekend we spent some time uh, taking off blazing star seed heads because
Mhm.
we started with like 10, 15 plants and now we have 100 plants in a small area because it
1,000.
so we used to leave them, but we cut them now just because they are getting out of control. And some of our goldenrod too, we've cut off seed heads so we don't end up with it everywhere
Mhm.
any more than we already have where it's spread. I mean, when it comes to cutting back perennials, so this time of year, again, you don't really need to unless you're trying to again manage for seeds or something like that. More when we're doing this, really want to do most of our cleanup in the spring. Ideally, when soil temperatures have warmed. Think about when you would plant your tomatoes mid-May timeframe. By then, soils have warmed up. Those insects utilizing that habitat that have overwintered, by then are more than likely have emerged. So that's when we really want to do a lot of our cleanup in the spring. And if we're cutting back perennials, those flower stalks typically we want to leave 12 to 18 inches of those flower stalks behind because those are hollow and a lot of our cavity nesting bees um, may utilize those. So like things like small carpenter bees, if it's really big, mason bees, leafcutter bees, a lot of other types of bees, and some wasps will utilize those flower stalks um, to build their nests and stuff. And then they'll build their nests, and then those stalks they will overwinter in that. So in the following spring, they're emerging. So you're leaving that stuff for over a year. Those stalks, so they can use it in the spring, overwinter, come out the following spring. So if you are cutting back stuff now, leaving those flower stalks 12 to 18 inches tall, so they can utilize those. Um, and usually your foliage is going to be up above that anyway, so it looks maybe kind of unsightly in the spring to some people. But as those plants start to grow, that foliage is going to cover it, and you're not really going to notice it much at all. I think like cone flowers and stuff like that. Those plants will get much bigger than that 12 to 18 inches.
So yeah, I don't really worry about the stems and the stalks. I have on occasion moved a couple pieces of, like, we have a table that we moved into our house once. It was a plywood table. It was in our garage. We set up like a train. We have a 1960s train set that was my dad's, and we set that up. And about a week later, we had all of these small carpenter bees start to emerge in our house. So that was a little bit of a surprise. I felt really bad. Like, oh no, what are we gonna do? It's the middle of winter. There's not much that we can do. Um, so yeah, they will find nesting spots in these different areas and use the debris to lay eggs and to overwinter. Um, Most of the time when I find something like hostas, stuff like that, those will usually turn into mush. I don't really have to do much next spring with them. If there is any residue still there, maybe I'll like pull it up with my fingers or something. But yeah, there's not much that I really have to do. Very often, the next spring, I will take like a leaf rake and I'll just sort of sift everything up a little bit, kind of mess it up a little bit, kind of like tossing your hair a little, and I just kind of get some of those debris sifted down into the mulch layer. So I leave a lot of it standing. The other thing that it helps is that I can see where I might have planted something the next year, especially some of our milkweeds and asters and things that emerge a little bit later in the season. Um, that next spring I can be like, is that a weed? Oh no, wait, that's the milkweed stem right there. I know that I shouldn't be messing around right there. So there's some benefit too of this, that knowing where plants are located.
Yeah, and if you've got disease issues or something like that, then you probably want to clean up
Mhm.
uh, fairly well. We're talking a lot about native plants. When you think about like roses, something like that, if you got a lot of black spot or something on there, and if you've got your roses have gone really crazy, and you've got these really long canes, you probably
Mhm.
want to cut those back a little bit so they're not wind whipping, causing damage. But you don't want to prune back too far because more than likely we're going to get some winter kill,
Yeah.
and then you find out where that how far down is killed, and then prune that off. So there is some stuff you can do, but a lot of it's going to depend on the aesthetic you're going for. If you got a more formal type garden, you're probably doing a little more cleanup than if you're sounds like us,
Mhm.
where you don't really care as much.
It's our job to not care about plants. That's right. Oh, yeah. And yeah, we can break some of those disease cycles, kind of. I mean, we all live close to other people. So when we talk about like trying to break the disease cycle of something like apple scab on your crab apple, yeah, you can collect those leaves, you get rid of them, rake them, burn them, shred them, whatever, mow them up. Um, but your neighbor next door or two houses down probably also has a crab apple. Maybe it has apple scab. They might not be doing anything about it. That inoculum blows on over in the wind next year. You got it again. Or cedar apple rust is another one where the inoculum lives on a completely different host plant. So there's all these things that we can do to help break these disease cycles and cleaning up the garden. But it can be difficult when you live in more of a densely populated area.
Yes, but you can sleep easily at night knowing that you're not the cause of it,
That's
or
right. That's right.
or you're less of a cause than others.
I like that. Well, Ken, I mean, to do all this work, I guess we need tools, don't we? We need to take care of our tools after all. So, um, they, wh- what would you say about our tools as we get ready for winter? What should we be thinking about with those?
So hopefully you're doing this throughout the year.
Mhm.
But probably that last time you're using the tools, you're not planning on using them anymore for the year. Going through doing a really good cleaning, making sure you get all the soil, sap, whatever other gunk, maybe like on those metal parts if you have pruners, on shovels, things like that. Cleaning that off, stiff wire brush. If you've got any rust, take some steel wool or sandpaper, get that rust off of there. Um, and then treating it with some kind of rust inhibitor, seem like things like WD-40. Uh, People putting sand in a bucket and mixing in motor oil with that, dipping those tools in there, wiping it off, just so you have something that's going to inhibit that rust from forming on those tools. Um, you could sharpen, when you're done, or if you need something to do during the winter, sharpen your tools, get them ready for the following year.
Mhm. So when I did landscaping, we were not allowed to put a dirty tool away. And so that really got me in the habit of like, all right, I'm done using the shovel. I usually will take like a old paint scraper or something and I'll clean everything off. And um, we had Richard Henschel on the show, and he said, "Well, I scrape it off, and then I use an old burlap sack to kind of scrub it up because burlap is very coarse, and so that's what I do now, following Richard in Richard's footsteps here. So yeah, so I've got an old burlap potato sack that I use after I scrape off the dirt, and I just kind of wipe it down. So yeah,
I'm I'm better than I used to be, but I'm still not very good about cleaning up when I'm done. I'll be
well,
New Year's resolution for next year.
there you go. I will add, for all of the hard work that I put in on keeping my tools clean, my garden tools clean, um, where they're supposed to be, and all that. My kids come in and total like I have found my shovel sitting in the woods in the backyard, and I'm like, how long has this been out here? It's like probably been like a month or so that they just took it out there and just left it. So you can recover from that, folks. I'm just saying that it was covered in rust when I found it. The wooden handle was soaked in water, and it was a mess. But we brought it back. And I think that's what we're going to talk more about next week, right? When we talk about our garden tools, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah, we can do a deep dive on
Hmm.
caring for them and get into lawnmowers and stuff too if you want.
Yeah. Yep. How to save your stuff from your kids. Yeah. Can be good.
I don't know if I have a good answer for that.
They break everything.
Lock them out of the garage or the shed.
Yeah. Oh man. Tools and furniture. Oh, watch out. Yep. Worse than cats. Oh my goodness. Well, that was a lot of great information about putting the garden to bed and other things that we can be doing this fall. And then I guess, yeah, we'll dive into tools next week. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by me, Chris Enroth. Hey, Ken, thanks for being here, chatting with me, sharing about how we put our landscapes to bed, and trying to give some folks some tips and advice.
Yes, thank you. It's winter will be here before we know it. Hopefully.
Winter is coming. Yes. Mhm.
Let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. As we said, we'll probably be diving deep into getting our tools ready for the wintertime. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening, or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing. Well, because man, can't talk.